Well, hey, I want to close out this series that we have been in called Appearances. We're going to finish this series in John chapter 21. So we've been looking primarily through John and focusing in on the appearances of Jesus after his resurrection. So we come up to, in John's gospel, the last appearance of Jesus in John 21. Now, if you weren't here last week, just a reminder, we spoke about Doubting Thomas last week. That's typically the name that he goes by, is Doubting Thomas, because that's just a behavior that he resembles. And Jesus himself told him, stop doubting. Stop doubting the resurrection. Stop doubting the things that I said. So we talked about how Jesus handled that situation and how the disciples handled that situation to what do you do when somebody among you is doubting God and doubting the character of God? How do you handle that? So we talked about that last week. And this week, before we jump into John 21, I want to highlight something that is very interesting, is that the order of events that happened with Doubting Thomas and then that happened with Peter here in John 21 is very similar. So with Doubting Thomas, you have a group of disciples that are all together, and then while this group is together, Jesus shows up among them. And then Jesus actually will display some form of bodily evidence or evidence that he's actually in the flesh. So he will eat something, which is a very common way in ancient times to show that you weren't a ghost, that you were actually flesh, was to eat something. So with Thomas, he shows up, he eats something, he eats some fish while he's there, and then as the night goes on, Jesus will then address one specific individual. For Thomas, it was Thomas. He's with the disciples, he eats, and then he addresses Thomas individually. And then what Jesus will do is he will restore that individual. The whole point of the encounter in singling them out is to restore them back to a place of faith, or whatever their shortfall was. And so we see the exact same situation or order of events with Peter in John 21. What happens is you have Peter. He's with a group of disciples, and he decides that he wants to go out and fish, and so they go with him. And while they're fishing, Jesus shows up on the shoreline, and he calls out to them, and they go to him on the shore. Jesus has fish and bread there, and he's eating, so he's showing a bodily evidence that he's in the flesh. And then it moves, and he addresses Peter individually. By the end of it, he's only talking with Peter, and it's with the intent of restoring Peter. And I just wonder, John, all the gospel writers, but especially John, is very intentional with details, order of events, structure, all these kinds of things. And I wonder, is John trying to tell us something by ordering these stories back to back in the exact same order, where it ends with Jesus with just one individual that he's speaking to? And the conclusion that I came to is that we often talk about doubting Thomas, but we never talk about doubting Peter. What if John was trying to show us that Thomas was not the only person that was doubting, that had doubt, but Peter did too? It was a different kind of doubt that Peter had. Peter wasn't doubting the resurrection, but Peter did have doubt in his life. See, Peter ends up in this place. We're now at the final sentences of the Gospel of John. But the reason why this whole thing had to happen at the end of the Gospel of John is because of Peter's actions earlier on in John's Gospel. It's at the Last Supper when Jesus knows that his time is coming to an end, and he begins talking to his disciples about the end, and he mentions that he has to go and die. They didn't understand completely what he meant by that, but they did understand that something was going to happen. And Peter obviously understood it, because Peter says, I'll follow you wherever you go. That's what he tells to Jesus in his zeal. He says, I'll go wherever you go. But Jesus corrects him and says, in fact, Peter, you will deny me 3 times before the rooster crows twice. And so, in fact, Peter does exactly as Jesus said he would do. He follows Jesus from a distance after they arrest him. He makes it all the way to where Jesus is being held, and he's hanging out around a fire with some of the workers and servants. And while he's there, they say, hey, weren't you one of those people that was with Jesus? You sound You sound like a Galilean. You look like somebody that we may have seen with Jesus. And by the third time, all three times, Peter denies not only being with Jesus, but then denies even knowing Jesus. And so he is full of shame, and I'm forgetting it now, but one of the Gospels even says that after he denies Jesus the third time, that Jesus makes eye contact with him. He actually sees him, and it's this moment of Peter realizing, oh man, what have I done? What have I said to these people? Who have I just denied? And so Peter is now full of shame because he's let Jesus down. He didn't do what he said he was going to do, which was stick with Jesus all the way. He didn't make it past the fire. He denied him 3 times already. And so now we find doubting Peter. Peter now believes that he's disappointed Jesus, and he doesn't think he can any longer be used by Jesus. This is the doubt that Peter was living in. And maybe you felt this way before. Maybe you felt like you have done something that has eliminated you from being used by God. That because of whatever it is, you're like, I just can't be used by God anymore. I've messed up too much. I'm too far gone for him to use me. I'm still a Christian. I still believe, but I'm probably ruled out from whatever it is. Fill in the blank. That's certainly how Peter was feeling. But the first piece of good news that I have for you today is very simple, but I think we need reminding of this. I know I do too. Your mistakes do not eliminate you from being used by God. Your mistakes do not eliminate you from being used by God. John 20, 21, and 23. This is before doubting Thomas, before this encounter that Jesus has with Peter. He's with all the disciples, minus Thomas, and this is what Jesus says to them. He says, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, I am sending you." And with that, he breathed on them and said, "Receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive anyone's sins, their sins are forgiven. If you do not forgive them, they are not forgiven." On the first night of Jesus' resurrection, he comes to the disciples and he commissions them. This is a commissioning moment that he has. And he commissions them to go and spread the gospel. This is John's way of sharing the Great Commission that we find in Matthew. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations. This is John's telling of that exact commissioning. He breathes on the disciples, and this reminds us of when God breathed into the nostrils of Adam. Jesus is doing the same thing here with the disciples. He's breathing life into them. And remember this correlation because it's important down the road here. And Peter was there for this moment. He was there when Jesus commissioned them, when he breathed upon them. But it seems like Peter eliminated himself from that commissioning. In his mind, he was so aware of his failure and what he had done that he eliminates himself from the commissioning that Jesus gave to all of the disciples that were there. He probably thought in his mind, surely Jesus isn't sending me considering what I've done. He's sending all of them because they didn't mess up. When actually in reality, they messed up too. They all deserted Jesus. But he was so aware of what he had done, he singled himself out and thought, Jesus can't possibly be talking to me right now. He can't possibly be commissioning me to go and spread the gospel. And I think that we do this to ourselves all the time. We mess up, we sin, and we have a tendency to let our mistakes and our failures begin to speak louder than God himself in our lives. We say things like this to ourselves. This is the inner dialogue that we have with ourselves. This is all I'll ever be good at. This is all I'll ever be good at. God has chosen somebody else now. I can't be trusted anymore because of what I've done. All I do is mess up. And this is how it will always be. I know that Peter was feeling this way. I know he was thinking these thoughts. Peter eliminated himself from the work that Jesus called him to, but Jesus never did. Jesus never once eliminated Peter from that. He knew he was chosen by Jesus, but he now believed that somehow, some way, he was unchosen by Jesus. Jesus has now gone back on what he said. He was in the room with all of them, but he was not among them in their chosenness. That's how Peter was feeling. But you know, Jesus breathes on Peter with full knowledge of what he had done. Jesus knew what Peter had done, but yet he still breathes on Peter like he did the rest. He commissioned Peter like he did the rest. I just picture what that would look like if Jesus really didn't want to commission Peter, and he was like breathing on the rest, but like pushing Peter aside so he couldn't actually get his breath on him. He's like, no, Peter, stay over there. I'm trying to breathe on all of them, not you. Stay over there. Well, no, he breathed on all of them. And Peter received that as well. You know that Jesus will actually use your calling to restore you. I know it seems kind of backwards because our mentality is, we have to get everything right. We have to get back in order, get restored, get healthy again, and then we can get back into the calling. And I see this a lot with water baptism. It's the same way. So many times people say, I'm not ready to be baptized in water. And scripturally, there is no ready to be baptized. If you confess Jesus Christ as Lord, then you're ready to get baptized. There's no amount of needing to get cleaned up in order to be ready to be baptized in water. It's something that happens instantaneously in Scripture. They believe, and they go find a body of water and jump into it. Like, that's just how it works. But that's our mentality so often, is before we can do something, we have to get everything in order first. But Jesus does it backwards. He uses the calling that he places on us, because when he calls us, it's one of the greatest ways that Jesus can affirm, hey, I've chosen you, and I'm sticking to that. I still choose you. I know who you are. I know the mistakes you've made, but I'm still saying yes to you. I'm still saying yes to you. So he was doing this with Peter. He's saying, I'm going to commission you just like the rest, even though I know you've messed up, because I need you to know that I still choose you, even though you've made mistakes. Do not eliminate yourself from my calling, because I have not eliminated you from my calling. And look at how Jesus reminds Peter that he still chooses him in spite of his failures. We look at verses 4 through 6. And this is now in the event itself. They've been out fishing all night. And it says, early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize that it was Jesus. He called out to them, friends, haven't you any fish? The language here, by the way, he pretty much says to them, little boys, have you caught anything? He's being very, very friendly with them. And they say, no. And then he said, throw your net on the right side of the boat and you will find some. And when they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. If this sounds familiar to you, it's because it is. This has happened before. This is the exact same scenario that Jesus calls Peter in at the beginning of the gospel. This is how Jesus calls Peter. So why does he do it again? Why does he repeat this scenario? Well, I told you to remember that the breathing upon the disciples was significant. So let's look back on that commissioning moment for a second. Jesus breathes on the disciples and he commissions them just like he breathed into Adam's nostrils and gave him life. But there was more to it than that when he breathed into Adam's nostrils. The reason why he gave him life was because he had a purpose. And so he goes on to tell him that purpose. And he says, and this is now with Eve in the photo as well, he says, be fruitful and increase in number. He says, fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea. Rule over the birds in the air. Rule over every living creature that moves. So the commissioning of God is tied to the purpose and the calling of God. He breathes into Adam, and then he commissions Adam as well. And we see a fruitfulness, and we see exercising God's dominion, which is a prosperous dominion. It's not a tyrannical dominion. It's not meant to cause harm and pain like we see in the world when people take dominion. It's not about that. It's ruling in order for it to prosper. That's what it looks like for God to exercise dominion. And that's what he wanted Adam to do and Eve to do. So we see now Peter has been breathed upon by Jesus. And look at Peter's situation. He goes out to fish, and he's in the most favorable conditions you could possibly be in for fishing. He's doing it at the right time. He's doing it at night. That's the best time for them to go out and fish. He's in the right spot. He's got the right gear. He's got the right team. And yet, he comes up with nothing. How is that possible? How does he come up with absolutely nothing when he had favorable conditions? He's just been commissioned by Jesus, and yet his first work is completely barren. You think John might be telling us something here? He's doing everything but ruling over the fish in the sea. Peter has no authority over the fish in the sea at this point at all. Jesus promises something to us, and we're seeing it here. We're seeing the lack of it here. Jesus promises fruitful labor when we work with him. Jesus promises fruitful labor when we work with him. So we see the opposite of that happening with Peter right here. It's anything but fruitful. What was Peter's plan with the fish? Scripture doesn't tell us exactly, but I think there's really only two options that would make any kind of sense. Peter probably wasn't out there fishing for the sport of it. Probably wasn't out there fishing just because he, needed to relax. And, the time that he went out, the people that he went out with, the gear that he took, he was out there for quantity, all right? He was out there to probably make a living with this fish. He was either going to sell it for money in the markets the morning after, or he was going to use it for their food. He was maybe trying to supply or provide for the rest of the disciples and get dinner or breakfast for them. But in the end, it was meant for his consumption and their consumption. That was the end goal of that fish. Fishing in itself is literally a drawing in process. The whole point is that you hook it and then you have to draw it into yourself. If you just hook the fish out there and you never draw it in, is it considered even catching a fish at that point? No. The whole point is that you drew it to yourself. That's what qualifies it as fishing. I've brought it to myself. Now, Peter, we know this because of the way that Jesus commissioned him and called him at the beginning of the gospel. What was Peter called to do? He said, I will make you a fisher of men. That's what Jesus' plan was with Peter. And he told them flat out, I will make you a fisher of men. Peter was called to draw all men unto Jesus. That was his calling. That was his purpose. But this is what shamed us. We see it happen right here in Peter's story. He's filled with shame. He says, I messed up. And now what? I'm supposed to serve God? How can I serve God? This happens the most when it comes down to being used in the church. We mess up, and the first thing we eliminate ourselves from is being used in the church. Because we think, God can't use me now. So I'll just go off and do something else. Because now I can't be useful in the church anymore. And this is probably what Peter's doing. He's like, I'm just going to go off and fish. Because I can't be useful to Jesus anymore. I'll just go off and find something else to do. It's kind of like, it's like we get fired from serving God. That's what it feels like. Like he's like, you're fired. I can't use you. But look at this. This is so cool. John 21, 9 through 14 says, when they landed, they saw a fire burning coals there with the fish on it and some bread. Jesus said to them, bring some of the fish that you have just caught. So Simon Peter climbed back into the boat and dragged the net ashore. It was full of large fish, 153. But even with so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, come and have breakfast. None of the disciples dared to ask him, who are you? They knew it was the Lord. Jesus came, took the bread and gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. This was now the third time Jesus appeared to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. I just want to pose a question to you here. Why did Jesus ask for them to bring the fish to him? Why did he ask them that? The scripture says very clearly that he already had fish and bread on the fire. He was making fish for them. There's something important about the fish making it into the hands of Jesus. Because if you look at the story, the moment the story begins to change, the results begin to change, is when they obey Jesus. He tells them, throw your net onto the right side of the boat and you will find some. And they obeyed Jesus. They did just as Jesus told them to do. And you know what happened in that moment? They started making Jesus the object of their labor again in that moment. Jesus was telling Peter, make me the object of your labor again. So he tells him, throw the net on the other side. Throw the net on the other side. And this is the turning point in the entire story. He says to them, not literally but figuratively, he's saying, you were fishing for yourselves, but I want you to begin fishing for me again. And this is interesting. It says at the beginning in verse 6 that when he tells them, throw your net on the right side of the boat and you will find some, it says when they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. Very clearly, it says they were not able to haul the net in at that moment. But then if you look at verse 10 and 11, it says, Jesus said to them, this is the King James because there's an important word in here. King James captured it correctly. It says, Jesus saith unto them, bring of the fish which ye have now caught. Simon Peter went up and drew the net to land full of great fishes, 153, and for all there was so many, yet was not the net broken. I know that's very difficult to understand. But there's a specific word in there. It says Simon Peter went up and drew the net to land. That word drew only appears one other time in Scripture, and it's the same use when Jesus says, if I am lifted up from the earth, I will draw all people unto myself. I will draw all people unto myself. Jesus was now the recipient of the fish instead of Peter and the disciples. And what happens? What's the result of this change? The moment that Jesus became the object of their labor, something they were not able to do, they were not able to haul the net in, the moment it was going to Jesus' hands, all of a sudden Peter by himself had the strength to draw the entire net in. Because now Jesus was the object of their labor. And he says, with me, when you work with me, I promise fruitful labor. But when you work unto yourself, you can be in the right place at the right time with the right gear, with the right people, and produce nothing. Because apart from me, what did he say to them in John 15? Apart from me, you can do nothing. How literal can you get it? They literally could do nothing without Jesus. And then Jesus transitions into a set of very unusual and very uncomfortable questions that he asks to Peter. It says in verses 15 to 18, it says, when they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Yes, Lord, he said, you know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my lambs. And again, Jesus said, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He answered, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Jesus said, take care of my sheep. The third time he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, do you love me? And he said, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my sheep. Very truly, I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go. I want to point out one last thing for you all today. There's another thing that John does here. The words for charcoal fire that we find when the disciples get back to shore, and it says that Jesus is cooking something for them, it says specifically on a charcoal fire. This only appears one time in all of the New Testament, and it's in John 18:18. And it's the same type of fire that Peter was warming his hands over as he denied Jesus. It says specifically a charcoal fire was the type of fire that they were warming their hands upon. And now Jesus has literally recreated that fire on the shore with charcoal, the same exact way. Jesus takes Peter back to that place. He evokes the memory and the emotions of the night that he denied Jesus. But why? Why does he do this? Why would he unearth all of that pain? Why would he unearth the shame? You know, Peter's probably excited because there's Jesus, and there's probably a great breakfast. I can only imagine if Jesus was making it. How great was it? But then he looks down and he sees a charcoal fire. And he's thinking, oh man. He's probably has the memory of that night. He probably remembers the questions that they were asking. Probably remembers the things that he even said to them. Why does Jesus do this? Well, I think that Jesus was revealing something in Peter's heart in this moment. You see, Peter, he worked really hard to show Jesus that he loved him more than the rest. Do you know that Peter was constantly doing that throughout the gospel stories? He was always competing with the others through his actions. He was always trying to be so extra with his actions to Jesus. Why? Because he was trying to show Jesus, I love you more than the rest. I can serve you better than the rest. I can work harder than the rest. I know more than the rest. That's why he was always the first one to answer. That's why he was always doing so much. Because he was trying to show Jesus, I love you more than the rest. He spoke when others were quiet. He acted when others did not act. He always gave the right answers. He protected Jesus when Jesus didn't ask for protection. And you know what? I think in Peter's mind, he thought, my love for Jesus is as clear as it could possibly be. I've done everything right. I even jumped out of the boat a few minutes ago when I saw Jesus. No one else jumped out of the boat, but I did it. When Jesus walked on water, I got out of the boat. No one else did it. Isn't it clear that I love you more than the rest? Jesus, what a dumb question. Come on. I know you know that this is true. It says the third time that Peter, his feelings were hurt because of this. Because Peter thought his love for Jesus was so obvious because of the things that he did for him. And the fact that Jesus would even question it, that he would even question Peter's love for him, was as if Jesus didn't recognize any of the things that Peter did for him in all of those years. And that's why it hurt Peter so much. But I think that Jesus' intention is very clear based on what he follows up with every time. He asks Peter, do you love me more than these? Do you love me? And he says afterwards in order, he says the first time, feed my sheep. Then he says, feed my lambs. He says, feed my sheep. And then at the end he says, follow me. Follow me. Jesus was trying to tell Peter, this is how I want you to show your love to me. To lead my people when I'm gone. What was Jesus doing? He was dismantling Peter's understanding of how he thought he was supposed to love Jesus. He was saying, no, no, no. This is how I want you to show your love to me. Feed my sheep. Feed my lambs. Follow me. This is what it looks like. It doesn't look like jumping out of a boat when no one else does. It doesn't look like being the first one to answer. It doesn't look like attacking the people that came to arrest me when I never asked you to protect me. It doesn't look like any of those things. It looks like doing what I told you to do at the beginning. Feed my lambs. Be the one I build the church upon when I leave. Peter, the rock. We love Jesus by obeying him. There's no fanciness in this last point. We love Jesus by just obeying him. This is discipleship 101. Peter was loving Jesus by competing with everyone around him. And Jesus is saying, Peter, you just don't get it. I want you to just do what I told you to do. I just want you to do what I told you to do. There's no need for us to invent new ways of loving Jesus or trying to prove our love for him. Obedience to his commands is all that he asks of us, plain and simple. And I think it's interesting that it ends in verse 18 and 19. Jesus tells Peter, he says, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and you went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go. And I think Jesus is saying very clearly right there, you have lived your life making your own decisions. Even while you were following me and you didn't realize it, you were the one that was driving those actions. You were making your own decisions. But he says, now you're entering into a time when you're going to love me the way I've asked you to love me. And this is how it's going to end. It's going to end with you doing something you don't want to do. But you know what? Peter went through. Church history tells us that Peter was crucified. He was crucified upside down. He went to the cross in obedience because he had gotten over himself. He said, I'm done loving Jesus the way I thought I was supposed to love him. And I'm going to follow him based on what he's told me to do. I'm going to be obedient to what he has told me to do.